During the period of the Soviet Union's collapse and subsequent geopolitical changes in the Eastern European regions, significant social and political shifts occurred that impacted the fate of the Russian population. In this video we will explore the dark side of this history, specifically how Russians were expelled from the different countries. The Baltic states are known for their discriminatory laws against Russians, aimed at pushing them out of the country, restriction of their rights and assimilation. After the Soviet Union's collapse, acquiring citizenship in Latvia and Estonia was limited compared to other Soviet republics. In most countries, anyone residing there could obtain citizenship, but in Latvia and Estonia, it was more challenging. Citizenship was only granted to those who resided in the country before 1940 and their ancestors prior to the country's annexation to the Soviet Union. This policy stems from the forced annexation of these countries, which is regarded as occupation. At the time of the collapse, approximately 30% of people residing in Latvia and Estonia were unable to obtain citizenship and were labeled non-citizens. This meant they had the right to live in the country, but faced limited rights and were unable to vote in elections or hold positions in the government, police, and so on. The policy was aimed at preventing Russians from attaining power and protecting their interests. Towards the end of the 1990s, the situation began to change slightly under the pressure from the European Union, allowing some individuals to acquire citizenship. However, they had to pass exams on the language, law, and history of the host country. As a result, a significant portion of the population in both countries remains non-citizens, and some have obtained Russian citizenship. In Latvia, there are approximately 200,000 non-citizens, accounting for about 10% of the country's population, while in Estonia, there are 70,000 non-citizens, comprising 5% of the population. Interestingly, Lithuania did not introduce similar laws, partly due to the absence of a significant Russian population. Today, they represent about 5% of the population and do not pose a significant force. Turkmenistan is known for its outrageous dictatorship. The number of Russians in Turkmenistan has been decreasing since the Soviet Union era and currently stands at around 5%. Exact data is unknown, as Turkmenistan is one of the most closed-off countries in the world. Interestingly, in the 1990s, Turkmenistan and Russia signed a dual citizenship agreement. However, after signing a gas agreement with Russia in 2003, Turkmenistan terminated the citizenship agreement, forcing people to choose only one citizenship. Interestingly, those who held Russian citizenship were unable to obtain a foreign passport. The discrimination against Russians in Turkmenistan has been a topic of discussion. However, Russia itself refrains from applying similar policies. The trend of Russian immigration after the dissolution of the Soviet Union can be observed throughout Central Asia. In Tajikistan, there were also many Russians during the Soviet era, but mass exodus of Russians began in the 1990s. Like in other countries of Central Asia, the region faced socio-economic problems following the Soviet Union's collapse, and Tajikistan became one of the poorest countries in the region. The country became unsafe to live in. A significant event that influenced the exodus of Russians were the pogroms in the 1990s, where Russians suffered. This event served as an important signal for Russians living in Tajikistan. In 1992, a civil war broke out, during which there were also cases of violence against Russians. As a result, the Russian population in Tajikistan decreased sixfold in the 1990s. Today, approximately 35,000 Russians reside in the country. In Kazakhstan, Russians also left the country in large numbers, despite it being the most successful Central Asian country. In the 1990s, 1.2 million Russians left Kazakhstan. In addition to economic factors, discrimination played a significant role, with about a quarter of Russians experiencing discrimination in the workplace. The exodus of Russians also occurred in Uzbekistan. At the time of the Soviet Union's collapse, 1.6 million Russians resided in Uzbekistan, and now there are approximately 700,000. Russians left Uzbekistan due to similar reasons, as well as worsening economic conditions, increasing crime rates, and growing national intolerance. Persecution of Russians mainly occurred in Chechnya during its de facto independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Control was lost in Chechnya, and it declared itself independent. It was noted that at that time, a significant number of Russians around 1.2 million resided in Chechnya. In the capital, Grozny, there were more Russians than Chechens. In the 1990s, Russians in Chechnya faced regular persecution by Chechens, and the local authorities turned a blind eye to it. However, the threats urging Russians to leave Chechnya began, and this escalated into actual violence. Russians were beaten on the streets, evicted from their homes, killed, and even subjected to slavery. This also affected other ethnic minorities residing in Chechnya. As a result, many Russians tried to leave Chechnya as quickly as possible, leaving behind their homes and possessions. It's worth noting that the then Chechen government, led by Dudayev, denied the persecution of Russians and considered it merely a pretext for starting a war. With the onset of the Chechen War, the persecution intensified even further, and Russians became associated with direct enemies who threatened sovereignty. I have a separate video on my channel discussing why Chechens harbored such hatred towards Russians. It was only with the restoration of Russian authorities in Chechnya that the persecution was finally halted. According to official data, during this period, 21,000 Russians were killed, excluding combat actions. 46,000 people were enslaved, and over 100,000 apartments were confiscated from Russians. Russians were permanently expelled from the region, and currently there are only around 25,000 Russians living there. Significant changes occurred in the status of the Russian population following Ukrainians' independence in 1991. The introduction of Ukrainization and the Ukrainian language as a state language led to discrimination against Russian speakers and the restriction of their rights. Laws were passed that limited the use of the Russian language in state institutions and educational establishments, resulting in a decrease in the presence of the Russian language in the public sphere. As a result of these measures, Russians began to experience national persecution and discrimination. Before the war, according to data, more than 8 million Russians lived in Ukraine. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Moldova embarked on a process of nation building, during which laws were enacted to strengthen Moldovan identity and restrict the rights of the Russian population. The Moldovan language was declared the state language, accompanied by limitations on the use of the Russian language in education, media, and state institutions. Russians faced difficulties in obtaining citizenship and participating in the country's political life. As a result, many Russians emigrated from Moldova. Now about 100,000 Russians live there. Russian migration also took place in Kyrgyzstan. In the 1990s, more than 200,000 Russians left the country for the same reasons. In Kyrgyzstan, there were also riots and persecution against the Russian population after the collapse of the Soviet Union. National tensions, economic problems, and political stability led to violence and the eviction of Russians from their homes and workplaces. Russians became targets of physical violence and threats from nationalist groups. Many Russians were forced to leave Kyrgyzstan and seek refuge in other countries. Now, about 300,000 Russians live there. After gaining independence, Belarus was also underwent policy changes aimed at national building and support for the Belarusian language and culture. The introduction of the Belarusian language as a compulsory subject in educational institutions and state events limited the use of the Russian language. Laws were enacted that restricted the activities of Russian language media and imposed limitations on the use of the Russian language in official documents. These measures caused dissatisfaction among the Russian population and became a reason for Russian migration from Belarus. Now, almost 800,000 Russians live there. Thus, Russians faced various forms of discrimination, restrictions of their rights, and violence in different countries after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This led to a mass exodus of Russian population from these countries and the search for new places to live and protect their rights and interests.